Just briefly, I'll recapitulate the story of the Trachiniae and Sophocles' play. Deianeira is waiting for her husband to come home. Her husband is Heracles. He's been on one of his many labors, so she's waiting, and she's a little worried that he doesn't like her sexually that much anymore because they've been together for a while. And in fact, instead of Heracles, the first thing that comes back to her is his new girlfriend, Iole, and she sees this young woman, beautiful woman, and starts to think that maybe she needs to do something. And she has this old potion at home, this kind of concoction that she got from one of her exes, and she thinks she's been told, and she thinks it must be a love potion. So she'll just put one of Heracles' shirts, or actually makes a shirt for Heracles, puts it in this potion, sends it to him, and actually it was completely poisonous. He dies of a terrible death and great agony, dramatic cries, and she kills herself as well. So this is just the story of Trachiniae. When Heracles' new young concubine Iole is introduced, Deianeira comments, "Her beauty has destroyed her life. This beautiful young woman now has to endure Heracles' sexual advances. Deianeira knows these sexual advances are unpleasant. After all, she is his wife." In speaking with a chorus of Trachinian young women, Deianeira wishes for them that they may not have to learn what marriage is really like. Their life as young girls to her seems wonderfully sheltered and sweet, and all happiness must end abruptly once a girl is married and becomes somebody's wife. This, in short, would be Deianeira's gist, the gist of Deianeira's take on marriage. Heracles made her his wife based on winning her at a contest. Actually, we just had a great illustration with Acrimonious and Heracles and Deianeira. It was there, it's no longer there, but thank you for that, actually. So Acrimonious had this preternatural uncanniness. He could metamorphose. He had a hybrid body. Deianeira found him abominable. And she was so scared of both Deianeira and Heracles that she preferred not to watch their fighting at all. Possibly when she says this is an even more potent way of conveying her horror than maybe an actual description might have been. So she says that she looked away, she had to look away, and this gesture of not looking, I think, holds in it the seeds of Deianeira's negative evaluation and judgment. They are both disgusting to her, and to see them both together in close combat seems like an abomination. As Faulkner said, this counter-image becomes an interpretive gesture. That's what Faulkner had to say about that. Deianeira's tale casts her as a helpless young woman in the circumstances. When Heracles arrives, he has been able to tackle this monstrous creature as his opponent, and his very ability to accomplish this puts Heracles in the same league with the feared Acrimonious. His terrifying attributes are thus transferred upon Heracles. We can analyze this representation further and realize that Deianeira basically rejected Heracles already before their wedding day and on their wedding day. She rejected him sexually and even physically, just on the plane of finding his appearance awful, but is trapped in the situation. And she has scrambled to make it turn out to the best in the time that she has been married. She still only was Heracles' wife because she was forced to be. So Heracles, suprahuman attributes were always already part of Heracles' identity, but readings of Heracles as a figure have always been ambivalent on whether he was more alike to maybe a gentle, well, not a gentle giant, but someone who does these services to protect humanity, so a good monster, or if he was, a monster in the sense of monsters being something really terrible that we have to ward off, kill, whatever. So he's always between these two poles. And in Deianeira's view, though, it is clear that Heracles is not just a monster killer, he is himself a monster. and now it gets worse. In his capacity as the legendary Heracles, he does not have this solid social status. He doesn't have a rich household to offer Deianeira, since Deianeira is herself a woman of aristocratic descent. We can assume that this is a major material loss to her, or at least something not like a normal marriage. And it's a social setback for Deianeira. She is left out of the norm of society and floats in a precarious sphere, sort of borderline. She's always in new towns because Heracles moves her a lot, and she's a guest also in the town of Trachis, where the Trachiniae takes place. The marriage to her unusual suitor, Heracles, failed to cater to the classic schema of a noble alliance. It has dragged Deianeira away from her family and the social networks of her hometown. She has no function and has been discarded as a companion sexually. Having whisked her away and transplanted her home temporarily to the new grounds of Trachis, Heracles has all but abandoned her. Deianeira, the aging aristocratic lady in a borrowed home, the wife of a man who has no regular identity, is not well integrated in any kind of social fabric there. At the play's opening, Deianeira is already quite far remote from her home comforts and located in a peripheral locus desperatus, one might say. She makes intimations of rape in her youth, and that Heracles led a purely reproductive sexual relationship with her during her childbearing years. Heracles had a habit, she tells us, of impregnating her and then leaving her by herself for extended periods of time. There are many things more to say on marriage and its socio-economic uses as capital for families, but if we look at Deianeira's alliance with this half-mythical, superhuman, but also essentially non-human man, Heracles, we have to admit that she does not appear to have an economically attractive marriage on her hands. After all, Heracles owns no land, is not part of the land-owning society at all. That she could not find any other husband, and that her family evidently handed her in marriage to Heracles without many second thoughts, is in itself a mark of Deianeira's isolation and rupture from her original society. Indeed, between waiting for Heracles, who is never home, and living in different towns that she does not know, Deianeira represents a precariousness or precarity seldom talked about in the portrayal of aristocratic women in tragedy. She speaks of herself as one who knows that she no longer really exists. Deianeira's existence is like a huge erasure. Iole's appearance on the scene once more persuades Deianeira of how superfluous and devoid of purpose her existence really is. And as I will now argue, the sense of one's own insignificance and erasure holds in it the seeds of disaster, for it fosters a carelessness that is precisely a force of fatality in the tragedy that unfolds in Trachiniae. In her desperation, Deianeira sent a poisoned shirt to Heracles, knowing that if it worked, they would live together happily, but if it did not work, there was always suicide. So, very desperate measures. No sooner is it done that she feels something about it could be wrong and says, I translate, "I shall never again advise unenlightened enthusiasm for action." So this is a very contorted sentence, which is also ambiguous in Greek. And yet it is revelatory of Deianeira's thinking and character at a crucial moment of the story. And it's even more revelatory, I might add, of the reader's way of reading it, because several interpretations are possible. Deianeira's brief moment of carelessness makes a huge difference. It's almost as if she was playing roulette with her husband's life. In fact, Deianeira is cognizant that she has become the author of a catastrophe. She was previously uncertain whether sending this robe to Heracles really was a good idea, but her deliberation upon the issue was unfortunately cut short when Lycus suddenly appeared on stage. Deianeira had to rush, and so she just chose to send him this thing anyway. So one may then read Trachiniae as a tragedy of carelessness, in a way, and one of sexual rejections. Heracles' sexual rejection of Deianeira and abandonment of her leads her to send the fatal poisoned shirt. But we will also now contemplate Deianeira's own distaste for Heracles. After first seeing Iole, Deianeira looks at Iole again and has a second wave of feelings. She says, "What secret bane have I received under my roof?" And then I translate, "A maiden, or I think no longer a maiden, but a mistress, have I received here, like a freight to a sailor, a merchandise malignant to my heart." So to refer to Iole as a young maiden at first, quickly to correct herself and call her a mistress, I think has an insulting aroma to it. And then identifying her as a malignant delivery is quite singular as well. Deianeira will send Heracles a poisoned shirt, imbued with a mysterious fluid that will turn out to be lethal, a kind of corrosive acid that will burn Heracles' skin, his body, throw him into agony, and eventually kill him. But with Iole, Heracles himself is sending Deianeira, his current girlfriend. She's named Iole, perhaps significantly, because in the name Iole is the word eos for poisoned arrow. So both send each other poison, so to speak, although one is metaphorical and the other is not, or rather, one is more metaphorical than the other. I will explain that. When Heracles gets the poisoned shirt, he puts it on, starts to burn from the outside in, and then his body shrivels. Significantly, as scholars have noted, he experiences his own reduction to a helpless state and a feminized state before he dies in dramatic agony. But then, this disease that he gets from the shirt is very real, but it is itself a metaphor too. Deianeira had always said Heracles' sexual appetite was sick. And when she sends the love charm, it is intended as a cure, which may also read as a pharmacological product intended to restore Heracles' proper or so-called proper eros. For Deianeira, Heracles' sexual appetite was his disease. And the poison she sends him is imbued with the blood of Nessus, who wanted to take revenge on Heracles precisely because of the love triangle in which he had previously found himself in between Deianeira and Heracles. So Hyllus, who is their son, reports that Heracles broke into a sweat as he found himself inextricably enveloped in the shirt that caused his skin to boil. It stuck to him as if it had been glued onto him by a technician, biting him like a poisonous snake. We start to imagine this disease which lives inside of Heracles like some kind of animal. The disease is cohabiting, it gnaws on his flesh, it sucks out his veins, just like a parasite or a predatory animal or a snake or something like that. The man carrying Heracles' stretcher tells Hyllus not to disturb the patient's sleep so as not to awaken this horrible raging illness. So it is clear that Heracles and the disease are one. It sleeps when he sleeps, it wakes up with him. Gradually, the disease supplants Heracles in terms of identity. So the disease becomes Heracles, and Heracles becomes the disease. In other words, when Heracles gets physically sick, his disease has more than one determination. It's multi-determined. It is A, a caustic injury to his skin, muscle, and bone. B, supersonic surpassment of his ultramasculine brutality in all its violent potentialities, and most of all, his monstrosity. So again, when I said earlier that some poisonings are more metaphorical than others, Heracles' condition is as much a physical reaction to a caustic dye as it is a metaphorical transformation into a disease which is itself presented as feral or bestial or predatory. So to put it broadly, very animal-like. So we have an almost metamorphosis, if you will, invested with strands of symbolic meaning rather than on top of direct representation of illness and superimposed upon this representation. Metamorphosis in Sophocles is quite a rare motif, at least in the extant plays. Thank you. There are fragments. A well-reconstructible play with naive metamorphosis would be Tereus, which is a Sophoclean take on the myth of Procne and Tereus and the rape of Philomela. The fragments tackle the myth of rape head-on, where animal metamorphosis is presented as punishment for moral turpitude and sexual violence, and also cannibalism. This is not how things are presented in Trachiniae, partly because he and Deianeira are married, and marital rape is not quite a concept at home in classical Athenian discourse, let's say in legal discourse. Yet Deianeira portrays such a reality. And of course, this means that the author Sophocles has problematized this reality as part of a tragedy. So I would argue, at least. There are interesting intertextual parallels between Tereus and Trachiniae, which we're not going to go into now. But I believe the increasing monstrosity of Heracles is born out of Deianeira's discourse and presentation of her own husband. For Deianeira frequently suggests that Heracles' nature is monstrous. In fact, when she's speaking of the figure of Heracles, like I said earlier, we never know if he's always ambiguous in between human and suprahuman and monstrous. And Deianeira constructs his monstrosity. She becomes the architect of the monstrosity of Heracles. Everything in her words suggests that her anguish before Heracles, whom she associates with monsters, was more fit for the encounter with a dangerous beast than with one's own husband. So the intimations of his fight with Achelous, combined with these loveless years, early years of marriage and disappointment with Heracles' social position, tell us that Deianeira had actually always abhorred Heracles. As she explains, she was terrified of even getting married. She saw herself in a position where she had no choice, and she tried to make the best of a bad situation. He may have, so she rejected him sexually, and he may have overruled her rejections by his bodily strength, by intimidation. But this in turn allows Deianeira to drench her entire depiction of Heracles in tones of monstrosity and moral turpitude. So, I will just very quickly sum up and then I'm done. The marriage to Heracles excluded Deianeira from living in the style to which she had been accustomed to all her life, and on top of that is plagued by unwelcome erotic advances and also carelessness after a certain age. Deianeira's complaints are a kind of proto-feminist lament, I would say, against the ills of misogyny and their encrustment in the institution of marriage. Deianeira decides to take away Heracles' good reputation by exposing or perhaps recasting him as a monstrous husband who is more or less a marital rapist. So this unhappy marriage is quite possibly not so much the result of Heracles possessing certain monstrous attributes as vice versa. Heracles' monstrosity becomes discernible to Deianeira, especially through her experience of a bad marriage. So not only does Heracles' potential monstrosity lurk under the surface of his being anyway simply of an unusual status, the monstrosity of Heracles in Trachiniae is engendered specifically and is compounded by Deianeira's erotic rejection. So this is how Heracles' monstrosity really comes to be in Trachiniae. Thank you.